Hi, welcome to the Aruba OS 8.3 how-to video series. This is the 11th video out of a 15 video series that covers the initial configuration and deployment of an Aruba OS 8.3 Mobility Master. This video specifically is going to talk about how we can leverage the Mobility Master to do things like move controllers around and within the Mobility Master, as well as some of the caveats with some of the other move commands that are in the command line. I want to demystify and kind of help reveal why some things don't work super well when you're trying to do move and clone commands for groups. Now, the easy one, the low-hanging fruit, is just moving controllers from one group to another. This is the most common request that we get. Usually someone creates a folder that they use for their test environment. They make sure everything looks good, and when it does, they go ahead and they move their controller up to the node above it. So that's kind of a fairly common thing. A less common thing, but something that does pop up every once in a while, is a request or a explanation as to how I can take a configuration from one folder and put it in another. That'll be a little bit more long-winded, but it should make complete sense once we go through the process. So first things first, to move controllers around an environment, if I do a show config node hierarchy, this is what we've got, and this is kind of the topology that we've been working with for this entire video series. Now, I'm doing this video last because I'm going to move around a bunch of stuff and I don't want to have to wait to move it back, but the overall structure is exactly what we've had before. So a good analogy for this is, let's say I've decommissioned Campus B, that building is no longer going to be mine, another company bought it or the lease ran out, whatever the case may be. I'm going to move my employees from Campus A over to Campus A, or from Campus B to Campus A. And I want that extra capacity, so I'm going to move those controllers over. So what I'll do is I'll take B1 first. I'm going to copy this MAC address, and then the command to move it is configuration device, and you need the MAC address. And then you'll see that there is a move to command. So I want to move this to MD Campus A. Now what the Mobility Master is going to do is it's basically going to send a command to this controller, this VMC B1, and it's going to say, I need you to re-terminate your connection from Campus B and move over to Campus A. And what that means is the controller is essentially going to add that to its local config, and then it's going to go ahead and reboot, and you can see from here that controller is now rebooting. And so it's going to reassociate to the MM and assign itself into Campus A, where it will inherit the config. And if you have watched any of the other videos, we have basically put a unique configuration, unique VLANs, etc. in Campus A, and another one in Campus B. So I've moved these devices over. This is the first one that I've moved. I'm going to go ahead and copy the second one. Whoops, the second one here. And we will do the exact same command, configuration device, this, and then move to MD Campus A. So while those two are moving over, I want to cover some of the other command options that you have. So I'm going to do a show config node hierarchy again so we can see this at the command line. So you can see now the configuration for the MM has all of the controllers in Campus A, and Campus B has nothing in it. So I could do something, I could rename the node. I can do that from the command line or the GUI. So let's say I want to rename, let me refresh this real quick. Let's say I want to rename Campus B, and we'll call this Old Campus. I can't type. Old Campus, and hit submit. So that's just a quick rename, and that in and of itself really isn't that hard to put in. You can see the new name is now reflected in the show config node hierarchy. The other thing that I may want to do, and this is what you're probably going to run into a lot when you start to try and clone configurations, and it's something that we're always going to try to work on and refine this process, but when you try it, I want to show you what happens. So let's say I want to create a new node. Let's say I want to call this configuration node, and let's call this MD dev test. Right, so what I want to do is create an environment that's similar to my production environment, but it's a place where I can kind of test my changes, and then once I'm sure those changes are good, I can replicate those changes up in Campus A, and then I know that my configuration should be good. And when I do this, if I try to create a new node, you have an option to either clone from or move to. So if I try to clone from, and let's just say I want to try to clone from MD campus A, you're going to see that there's an error where it says the cluster profile with name campus A cluster already exists. Now, the reason why there's an error here is because the requires, when you're using controller clusters, the requires a unique cluster name for every cluster. And if I try to clone from campus A that has a cluster, and then I try to replicate that into the dev test folder, it's going to spit an error out. And to show you what is essentially happening, I'm going to refresh here. If I go to cd md campus A, and remember some of our troubleshooting commands, I can do a show config committed. And all this really is, this show config committed, is the unique elements of the configuration that exist in campus A. So you can see I've got VLAN 200, I've got my VLANs, I've got my cluster profile, I've got some other stuff that's in here. So what I could do in theory is I could just copy this whole thing, and then what I could do is I could just create a new node. So let's just say I want to create a new node and say configuration node md dev test. So now I have a new node called dev test. I'm going to go ahead and go into it. And remember, I've copied essentially the entire config output, the config committed from campus A. And in my head, I think what I should be able to do is just go ahead and paste this entire element in. But you can see here that it shows that there is an error with the cluster name campus A cluster. I can't do that. I can't use IP addresses and cluster names of controllers that are already committed. And so that's why that throws an error there, and that's why the migration doesn't, when you try to do a clone from, that part doesn't work. Everything else you can see kind of pasted in, but this part did not, and that's why there's an error there. And so if we want to see kind of what this looks like, it hasn't written the config yet, so I'll go ahead and do a write mem just for giggles, and then I will do an exit out so I can get back into config. So now you can see that I'm in dev test. So let's do a show config committed. And you can see everything from the other side. If I open up a text folder and I kind of bring this over just to show a comparison, you can see everything made it over except the cluster config. So while it did throw an error, the rest of the configuration did actually go in there. And if I go into, let's refresh this page, if I go into dev test and I look at this from a configuration perspective, I'm going to see the WLANs are there. I'm going to see, let's say my VLANs are configured there as well. So all of that is in there, but it looked like it didn't work. So that's one thing to be aware of. If you want to go ahead and do a clone from kind of activity, that is one way to do it. The other way to do it, I'm gonna go back to cdmd campus. Actually, let's use old campus since I just created it. We'll refresh this, and if I do a show config committed, you can see I've got my VLAN 150, all of my SSIDs, my cluster config, etc. So I'm going to take all this and I'm going to copy it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this into a text file, and what I want is, let's say I know that I don't care about the cluster configuration information. Let's say I don't care about what's some other stuff that I may not care. I think everything else here should be good, right? So I know that it's going to choke on the campus on the cluster config, but everything else should be good. So I'm going to go ahead and copy everything from here, this text file, and then I'm going to do we'll do a configuration, and we'll do an MD, and we'll do dev test B. Oh, configuration node dev test B. So now I can go to MD dev test B, and if I do a show config committed, you'll notice that there's nothing in there. And so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and paste in what I copied from the text file, excluding all the cluster information, and then I can do a write mem. And now I have a newly replicated folder called dev test B, which is an exact copy of dev test, of old campus here. So now that I've done that, I can go ahead and just delete old campus. We'll just get rid of him altogether. And once we issue a write mem, all we're left with is dev test, which models campus A. And maybe what I want to do is go ahead and make all the names match and save dev test A. And then I've got dev test B, and this replicates the old deployments. And I can put controllers in here. I can test APs with the config, make changes here, and then once I've made those changes, I can basically copy those changes out and paste them into the campus that I have my production environment in. Some other things that you can do too. If we do a configuration node and question mark, you can see there's a replace config. That involves actually taking a config text file and importing it into a specific node. This would be analogous to if I have text files on a server that I can go ahead and pull from, I can use that as well. But if I want to do some other, we'll say campus A, I can move to another node. So let's say I want to take campus A and I want to move this underneath something else. Let's say I want to move him to, actually let's not do campus A because that's where my APs are. Let's take old, what do we have left? This is why I always do the show. Well, I just moved, I just created one called, old. So we'll just leave that there for now. But let's say I want to take dev test A and I want to move it under old. Let's do that. So let's say configuration node, and then I want to take MD dev test B, and I want to move him to MD old. Oops, sorry. I need to move to. So you can say it cannot move this current node. It says please change config node to other node before moving. So I need to get out of this node. Let's say, let's just go to CD my node. And so if I up arrow, try it again. That's not the one I want. There we go. I don't know why it's, oh, it says MD old is already present. So let's do no configuration app. I'm wasting time. So let's just do an old 2. So you can see there's no config file seen for dev test B. That's probably just because the way I've been pasting it in, I haven't fully written in a config. But generally speaking, the move to option is a little bit tricky for the same reasons that it's a little bit tricky when we try to do a clone from, in that there's a list of checks and balances that need to be there, and there's a lot of things under the covers that are required to be there. But the workaround for that, if you wanted to go that route, would be to just go ahead and when you do your show config node hierarchy, find the thing that you want to clone. In this case, it was dev test A or dev test B. I can go in there, I can do a show config committed, put that in a text file, modify the things that I want to modify, and then paste it into the new node that I want to put everything into. So again, I know it's not perfect. We're still refining and trying to make this better every iteration, but we're slowly making progress on kind of making this truly flexible to be able to truly move stuff around. The trick is trying to automate a way when there are overlapping elements to not create conflicts. So that's why you kind of see some of those errors. But there is a semi-manual way to do it with the show config committed commands. But if you have any questions or if you want to dive deeper into some of these issues, certainly reach out to the online help boards at community.arubanetworks.com or reach out to your local Aruba SE or partner. Thank you.